33-year-old male found dead a few days ago. Someone amongst them is our killer. Libyan rebels rise against Muammar Gaddafi. What at first appears to be a spontaneous uprising is, in reality, the culmination of a carefully managed, top-secret, 30-year-old CIA operation. The goal here is to get rid of Gaddafi, to overthrow him. For decades, America has been plotting to remove the man it branded the Mad Dog of the Middle East. Gaddafi was a chief sponsor of terrorism. They wanted him out. They wanted to make an example of him because there's evil in this world, and evil's got to be dealt with. What few people know as the rebellion against Gaddafi unfolds is that the man leading the uprising is, in fact, a longtime CIA asset, Khalifa Haftar, and his lieutenants were trained by the CIA to remove Gaddafi. There's a bunch of Libyans, you know, give them arms, say, all right, go get rid of Gaddafi. His relationship with the CIA dates back to the 1980s. He returned to Libya 20 years later to finish a job left undone. Recent investigations reveal that the Libyan rebels are directed and coordinated by CIA experts on the ground. This is the top-secret account of the true extent to which the CIA was instrumental in the Libyan revolution, which took down Gaddafi. CIA Headquarters, Langley, Virginia. The North Africa desk is buzzing. They are monitoring secret communications coming in from Libya. The satellites and electronic surveillance will be collecting huge amounts of communications between any sort of threat to the United States. The first 387 messages are innocuous, but when they reach the 388th, everything changes. It appears to be a direct threat. I got intercepts that were clear-cut. There was no question. No one could argue with them. The intercepted message reads, "Stand by and be ready to attack American targets and execute the plan." The CIA immediately considers it to be an imminent and credible danger. The message emanates from the intelligence headquarters of one of America's most dangerous enemies, Muammar Gaddafi. Since leading a coup to overthrow King Idris in 1969, Muammar Gaddafi has been a tyrannical dictator of Libya. He took over in 1969 as a very young colonel and managed to institute a system of divide and rule. He made sure that the army high command never grew too strong. Originally, the West had thought they might be able to deal with Gaddafi. I think there was hope that the US could work with him, but that quickly went away. Having quelled dissent in Libya, Gaddafi soon embarked on a campaign of murdering Libyan opponents abroad. He had spies everywhere, both at home and abroad. He very much kept a watch on the exile movement. He wanted to get rid of these opponents who had left Libya, and he sent assassination squads to Europe and hired people in the United States to kill members of the opposition. He had his hit teams out, knocking off Libyan exiles. He allowed dozens of terrorist groups to run training camps in Libya. It's often said that he was the key controller of terrorist groups, certainly in the Middle East and, to some extent, Africa. Muammar Gaddafi gave money, weapons, passports, and safe haven to a number of terrorist groups. The CIA had long suspected he was actively targeting America. Gaddafi was seen as the bogeyman because of his sponsorship of terrorism. They didn't like Gaddafi. They looked at him almost as an ideological menace. The CIA knew that Gaddafi was behind terrorist acts around the world, including the slaughter of American and Israeli civilians by Palestinian gunmen at Vienna and Rome airports in 1985. He was a significant enemy to the United States for most of my time in the CIA. He was a problem one way or another. But what makes Gaddafi truly terrifying is his unpredictability. This mad dog of the Middle East had a goal of a world Muslim fundamentalist revolution. President Reagan famously called him the Mad Dog because Gaddafi's behavior was so irrational at times. He was a lunatic. The man at times seemed to be unstable, but on the other hand, he was obviously clever, and he played things very well. Now, it seems that the Mad Dog is ordering a direct attack on American targets. The question is, who are the targets, and where are they? Later that day, Libyan intelligence officers contact their agents abroad. The message is intercepted by a CIA listening post. The Americans had managed to tap into pretty much all Libyan communications with their diplomatic premises abroad. The Libyans were not nearly as careful about covering their traces as, say, the Syrians or the Iraqis. So the Americans knew that something was afoot. The CIA discovered the location for the attack, Germany. The communication had been with East Berlin, and the People's Bureau in East Berlin had tipped them off. The message from the Libyan embassy in Berlin reads, "Tripoli will be happy when you see the headlines tomorrow." The CIA now had a date and a rough location but little time to try to stop the attack. The CIA station in Berlin was put on full alert. All they knew was that someone, somewhere in the city, was preparing an attack on an American target. Agents were ordered to contact all informants to gather any intelligence about the impending attack. But as the hours passed, their investigations yielded little actionable intelligence. In the early hours, at the La Belle nightclub, a spot popular with American GIs, revelers were enjoying their night out. Nobody noticed a woman entering the club carrying a bag. Then, in Langley, another message was intercepted. Again, it originated from the Libyan embassy in East Berlin, sent at 1:30 a.m. The Libyans did that just minutes before this bomb attack took place. The message simply says, "Happening now." There's been yet another major terrorist incident, this time in Berlin. A bomb ripped through a nightclub frequented by Americans. 230 people were injured in the blast, 3 would die, a young Turkish woman and 2 U.S. soldiers. The bombing of the La Belle disco in Berlin was a seminal event in that Americans died for the first time. The CIA had cast iron evidence that Gaddafi was behind an atrocity against their citizens. This particular bombing, which killed a lot of innocent civilians, was kind of a touchstone for the U.S. government. They now had some evidence that they could use openly. There was certainly good information that Gaddafi was behind the Palestinians who blew up the La Belle disco. There was enough intelligence to indicate that the bombing was not an isolated event. It really was a pattern of operations that Libya was engaging in and was absolutely going to continue into the future, and they would get worse. This is not a case of picking on some guy to make an example of him. The man wasn't innocent at all. Gaddafi was indeed doing what the Reagan administration was saying that he was doing. There is such a thing as evil today. It is not popular to talk about evil. I mean, there aren't any evil people in some people's minds, but anybody who supports terrorism is evil, and evil's got to be dealt with. In Washington, a decision was made. They had to punish the Libyan leader. It was enough for the Reagan administration to go after Gaddafi. That was the fuse that lit the whole thing. Dealing with Gaddafi was at the top of foreign policy, from the president down to the executive agencies like the CIA. The big sea change was becoming more aggressive for the first time on terrorism. The Reagan administration said, "We're going to draw a line in the sand." They saw it as an opportunity to have a regime change there, one way or the other. The United States felt that it needed to send a signal to these state sponsors of international terrorism. When our citizens are abused or attacked anywhere in the world on the direct orders of a hostile regime, we will respond. So long as I'm in this Oval Office, there is no question now that America will retaliate. The only issue is how to lead the fight. Reagan turned to his hardline head of the CIA, William Casey. Reagan was really looking to establish a much more muscular foreign policy, and he had in his team people like William Casey at the CIA. Casey was obviously a very intelligent guy. He was a risk-taker, and that's different from being a gambler. He was a very intimidating person. If you were afraid of him, he had a very short temper. He didn't suffer fools lightly. In many respects, he was a wild man. He had really no time for the moderates, to make nice. Casey was determined to do something about Gaddafi. He was very hawkish, and he wanted to restore American prestige around the world. Casey suggested a top-secret black operation in which Gaddafi would be eliminated. But getting to Gaddafi would be extremely difficult. He was a maverick, but he was a maverick with a level of desert cunning that made him very, very difficult to remove. Libya is a military state. Gaddafi is protected by thousands of dedicated troops, including a personal retinue of female Amazonian bodyguards. On top of this, the CIA had barely any agents or assets in the country. I told them we didn't have the capability of the kind of message they wanted. Casey also had another problem. Political assassinations had been outlawed in the United States since 1974. During Watergate, Gerald Ford, the president, issued an executive order banning assassinations by any agency, including the CIA. Early in his presidency, Reagan had reaffirmed this commitment. Reagan himself had signed the presidential directive that forbade assassination. So Casey's hands were tied. They wanted to remove Gaddafi without contravening that directive. A covert assassination attempt on an individual may be against the law, but overt military action against the Libyan state is regarded as a legitimate and justified response. The U.S. response was really a military operation. The president initiated Operation El Dorado Canyon. Instead of sending in a CIA hit squad, the U.S. would launch airstrikes on a series of military targets inside Libya. The decision was taken to go after the command center. Both the president and Casey knew that the command center was actually Gaddafi's home. It was a substantial bombing raid against Libya and specifically against Gaddafi, targeting his huge compound in Tripoli. This was an assassination attempt in all but name. Now, sitting around that table, there wasn't any winking or eyes rolling about what they were really up to. Everybody knew damn well that there was a good likelihood that they could take out Gaddafi without targeting him. To attack the residence or home of the leader is clearly a targeted assassination, just like if somebody were to try to attack the White House. What's the difference if you're going to kill somebody, whether you do it with a single bullet to the head or with a 2,000-pound bomb? Let's not have an argument about it. For Operation El Dorado Canyon, U.S. planes would launch raids on a series of targets in Libya's main cities, Tripoli and Benghazi. It was up to the CIA to provide the intelligence on the exact locations of the targets for the strikes. The National Photo Interpretation Center, which belonged to the agency, provided the photography that was used during the planning for which places to attack. The targets included military compounds, government buildings, and anti-aircraft batteries. But the key target was Gaddafi's command center, a sprawling compound in the heart of Tripoli, which included Gaddafi's home and a Bedouin tent where he was reported to spend most of his time. The problem was hitting Gaddafi's command headquarters, which they all knew was connected to his home. The difficulty the CIA faced was timing. The bombers needed to strike when they could be certain Gaddafi was in his tent. Without agents on the ground, this would be almost impossible to know. The intelligence available as to Gaddafi's whereabouts wasn't particularly very good. So Casey turned to Israel. Israel is a very close ally, both politically and in intelligence areas. Agents from the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, set up a surveillance post overlooking Gaddafi's compound. They located the tent and confirmed that Gaddafi was in there. The main contingent of US F-111 bombers took off from American airbases in Britain. As the bombers crossed the Mediterranean Sea, fighter planes on U.S. aircraft carriers were scrambled to escort them into Libyan airspace. As the American bombers approached Libya, the Israeli surveillance team confirmed that Gaddafi was working late into the night in his tent. Having reported this back, the Mossad agents withdrew. 40 minutes later, the first F-111 jet struck. Casey and other key CIA chiefs were assembled in their offices, having a drink as they waited for news. Casey was there, maybe 2 or 3 others, and they listened to the information coming in on the particular attack. Eventually, they received confirmation that the bombers had hit the Libyan military targets. It seemed that the mission was a success, although there was no official confirmation of Gaddafi's fate. Meanwhile, at the White House, the president had assembled his military advisors. An hour into the raid, 2 men arrived at the White House with a videotape in a locked briefcase. They played the tape to the president and the assembled military chiefs. It was the footage from the F-111s conducting the airstrikes. Later that evening, President Reagan took to the airwaves. At 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activity. The following day, a reconnaissance aircraft was sent to survey the damage. They put up in State Route 71 when they had some daylight, and it ran a mission to actually look at what had happened on the ground. It confirmed that the bombers had hit the CIA's most important target, Gaddafi's compound. It had been devastated, and Gaddafi's tent was leveled. But there was still no news on the fate of the Libyan dictator himself. The following evening, news channels broke the story that Reagan and Casey had dreaded. Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Muammar Gaddafi apparently is alive, but questions still far outnumber answers, and mystery still rules 48 hours after U.S. combat jets blasted Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Now, in the aftermath of the U.S. attacks, Gaddafi's regime exploited the collateral damage caused by the bombings. Although later proven to be a lie, Libyan news agencies even claimed that Gaddafi's adopted daughter was among the 60 dead. The grim truth for the CIA was that the mission had failed. The results were probably not what anybody expected. They expected better results. The goal of El Dorado Canyon was to get rid of Gaddafi, and that didn't happen. Gaddafi was not even injured. With the door closed on further military operations, CIA Chief Casey had to now turn to other means to eliminate Gaddafi. I don't believe the niceties of how he would be removed from power bothered the Reagan administration. They wanted him out. Casey now focused on a classic clandestine CIA method. The agency would foment an uprising of Libyans to overthrow Gaddafi. In terms of getting rid of foreign leaders who pose a threat, there's always third parties that can be used to do this. It is a strategy the CIA has employed successfully for decades. From Guatemala to Chile, the CIA has covertly supported rebel groups to oust anti-American leaders, providing them with training, weapons, and high-tech equipment. When you think about it from an operational perspective, it's the best-case scenario. The US government doesn't have to get its hands dirty, per se, and the third party does it. If something goes wrong, well, they take the blame for it. Critical to this sort of action is having the right person to lead the rebels. Casey believed that if he could find the right leader, a Libyan rebellion was the best way to be rid of Gaddafi. Already, there had been efforts about putting together a paramilitary force of Libyans to try and have a little regime change in Libya. For 7 years, Casey had been secretly supporting Libyan opposition groups in neighboring countries, providing weapons and training. The problem for the CIA was that the Libyan opposition to Gaddafi was divided. Libya is not a country, it's a bunch of tribes within colonial borders. How do you raise the Libyan tribes? This isn't Lawrence of Arabia. Casey realized that he needed someone from Libya who could unite the different factions. The men Casey was looking for needed to be someone who knew Gaddafi well. The idea was to get as close to Gaddafi as they possibly could, especially his generals and others who would certainly be the target of the CIA. Eventually, Casey believed he had found the men he wanted to lead the Libyan rebellion, Colonel Khalifa Haftar. At first glance, Haftar seemed an unlikely choice of leader for an anti-Gaddafi force. He was one of Libya's leading military commanders. Khalifa Haftar was a professional soldier. His relationship with Gaddafi went right back to the day of the revolution when they overthrew King Idris. He was a skilled tactician who commanded loyalty from his troops. For much of his career, he had been involved in fighting with Libya's southern neighbor, Chad. He was very much involved in Gaddafi's occupation of a big chunk of Chad, which Gaddafi always had designs on. Despite leading a fearsome campaign in 1986, just at the point when Casey was looking for someone to lead the rebellion, the Chadian army regrouped and overwhelmed Haftar's forces. Several hundred Libyan troops, including Haftar, were captured and imprisoned. Back in Libya, Gaddafi was furious. His army had been decimated, and tens of millions of dollars in equipment lost. He blamed Haftar for the failure and left his former friend to rot in a Chadian prison cell. At that point, Gaddafi washed his hands with the whole operation, as if there weren't any Libyan troops anywhere, and he didn't know anything about the Libyan troops who had been in Chad and had disappeared. For the CIA, Haftar's imprisonment was a major recruitment opportunity. If they could convince the colonel to turn against Gaddafi, he would be the perfect man to lead the rebel forces. So the CIA activated one of their major assets, the president of Chad himself, Hissène Habré. The CIA had provided substantial support to Habré in his wars against Gaddafi. Now, Casey decided to call in the favor. After 7 months languishing in a Chadian prison, Haftar was visited by President Habré. It was reported that Habré at one point went to see him. It is believed that the Chadian president made Haftar an offer on behalf of the CIA. Habré offered him the option of turning against Gaddafi, of joining a rebellion, of forming an army in exile, and then marching on Libya. Having been abandoned by Gaddafi, Haftar agreed to side with the CIA. Haftar and many like him decided that they would turn against Gaddafi, and they formed the Libyan National Army. In a classic CIA maneuver, a small force was put together. At its core were the 300 men captured with Haftar. The CIA would arm and train the force with the aim of using them to instigate an uprising in Libya. The force was certainly trained by CIA people, and the weapons, of course, came from the US, as did the money and the vehicles. The idea was that a force would be formed that would be big enough and strong enough to go back and at least begin to sow the seeds of a rebellion inside Libya. The United States began to train Libyan resistance fighters to go back into Libya and overthrow Gaddafi. 2 years on from the US military attacks on Libya, Gaddafi remained strangely quiet. The US believed that Operation El Dorado Canyon, while failing to kill him, had at the very least deterred him from further terrorist activity. But Gaddafi was secretly planning another devastating act of terrorism, which occurred in late 1988. Pan Am Flight 103 prepared to depart for New York from London Heathrow. Among the baggage was the suitcase of a Libyan agent who never boarded the flight. Clearly, Gaddafi didn't give up. The most dramatic piece of evidence that Gaddafi didn't learn the lesson of El Dorado Canyon is the fate of Pan Am 103. Hundreds of passengers boarded, most of them Americans heading home for Christmas. As they took off, the passengers were unaware that they were in imminent danger. 38 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft passed over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, a time device in the suitcase went off. All 243 passengers were killed, as were 11 people on the ground. Gaddafi had struck again. We charge that 2 Libyan officials, acting as operatives of the Libyan intelligence service, along with other co-conspirators, planted and detonated the bomb that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103. At the time, it was the worst terrorist attack ever inflicted on American civilians. After Lockerbie, the whole world responded, not with bombs, but with sanctions. Gaddafi was frozen out. He became an international pariah. The CIA, however, remained determined to go even further. Gaddafi had managed, through his own actions, to put himself at the top of the hit list for the United States. In Washington, they were pinning their hopes on a revolution to overthrow the men they called the Mad Dog, led by Khalifa Haftar and his CIA-trained force of rebels. Then, events in Africa ruined the CIA's plans. In 1990, the pro-American government of Libya's neighbor, Chad, was forced out and replaced by a new president who was hostile to the US-backed Libyan rebels. So suddenly, you had these several hundred Libyan soldiers sitting in Chad, getting ready to take action against Gaddafi, but the new president of Chad didn't want them there. Worse still, the coup had been supported by Gaddafi, and now the Libyan leader wanted his payback. Gaddafi knew all about Haftar's army, and he demanded that they be handed over to him. Gaddafi wanted Haftar dead. The CIA was forced to come to Haftar's rescue. The Americans came in with transport planes into N'Djamena and removed them, and then this odyssey started that went on for the best part of a year. America funded the evacuation of Haftar's force from Chad in what became known as Operation Magic Carpet. The 300-strong group was transported first to Nigeria, then on to Zaire, and then finally to Kenya. But the CIA-backed rebels discovered that they were unwelcome in country after country. Ultimately, the Americans were left with no choice but to bring them back to the U.S. The man the CIA wanted to lead the Libyan rebellion settled in suburban Virginia, only a short drive from CIA headquarters in Langley. His men were settled across the country in 25 different states. After this long odyssey across Africa, Haftar settled in Falls Church, Virginia. He lived in a very nice house. He had a lot of kids, but he still always harbored this idea of returning to Libya. For the CIA, it was a huge disappointment, but they retained the hope that at some point, Haftar's force would be able to regroup and return to Libya. As the years passed, Gaddafi was contained by relentless sanctions and continued international political pressure. Then, in September 2001, the kind of threat that Gaddafi posed to the world was placed in a very different context. On September 11, 2001, 19 Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners and crashed them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. It was the dawn of a new age of terror. A much more frightening force than Gaddafi emerged from the shadows: Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was not state-sponsored. It marked a revolutionary shift in terrorism. So America moved to all-out war. Every nation and every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists. With the stakes dramatically raised, Gaddafi switched sides. Gaddafi's change, or supposed change, didn't surprise me, frankly, because he is a total opportunist. Gaddafi did a remarkable turnaround. Publicly, he came out against terrorism and acts of terrorism. He went out of his way to build a relationship with the U.S. government. Few believed Gaddafi was really a changed man. He was simply desperate to save his own skin. Gaddafi was afraid of the George W. Bush administration. The administration was talking about weapons of mass destruction. It was focused on Saddam Hussein, but Gaddafi didn't want to take a chance that he would be enemy number one again. He realized that his plans against the West were going nowhere and that essentially, he could lose his government and even his own life. The one-time mad dog of the Middle East quickly reinvented himself as a valuable ally in President Bush's war on terror. He made a strategic calculation and did a deal with the United States. The effect of that was that he became a poster child for unilateral disarmament. Today, in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country. It was an almost inconceivable change in relations between Gaddafi and the West. Gaddafi, the former international pariah, was visited by a stream of Western leaders. Sanctions were dropped, oil flowed out, and money flowed in. With the war against Al-Qaeda, America's primary objective, and by appearing to have transformed himself into an ally, Gaddafi had succeeded in removing himself from the CIA's hit list. Gaddafi was never worthy of an American embrace as a human being. Gaddafi's record is horrendous, and that's not a record that you could ever expunge. But American interests in the region changed over time. In 2009, Gaddafi was even invited to speak at the United Nations in New York. It seemed his rehabilitation into the international community was complete. However, in a 90-minute rant to the United Nations, Gaddafi called the Security Council terrorists, said George Bush should be charged with war crimes, and demanded $7 trillion in compensation for colonialism. To the CIA, it was clear that Gaddafi remained as unstable and dangerous as he ever was. 2 years later, a new opportunity for the CIA to deal with Gaddafi arose: the Arab Spring. Inspired by revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, popular protests broke out across Libya in February 2011. As the Arab Spring took off, it finally percolated through to Libya, and a protest in Benghazi got out of hand and quickly became an uprising. Gaddafi sent his troops against the protesters, believing no one would interfere. Gaddafi probably in 2011 concluded that he was going to be okay, that the Americans would not move against him. But he was wrong. As the Libyan protests grew into an armed opposition, the U.S. joined its NATO allies in providing air cover to protect Libyan civilians from Gaddafi's troops. Today, I authorize the armed forces of the United States to begin a limited military action in Libya. That action has now begun. NATO's mission in March 2011 was essentially to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi. It was clear that there was going to be an absolute bloodbath as Gaddafi's forces moved east, and the Benghazi uprising was essentially no more than that. It was just a chaotic popular rebellion that could have easily been suppressed by Gaddafi's forces. But NATO's mission then began to creep. It began to involve hitting anything that Gaddafi had that moved, not just his air force but anything on the ground that moved. Under the protection of NATO air support, the Libyan rebel forces grew in strength and now controlled much of eastern Libya. But for the CIA, the rebels posed a problem. Some of them were potentially a threat to American interests. At that point, the Transitional National Council, which was trying to get its act together, trying to form a united front against Gaddafi, was all over the place. There were factions, rivalries within the military apparatus. The worry was that Islamic militants like Al-Qaeda would hijack the revolution. The CIA wanted to see a military commander they could trust, Colonel Khalifa Haftar, in charge of the rebels. The Americans wanted Haftar to go back to Libya to join the fight, to professionalize the rebellion. For Haftar, once a senior leader in the Libyan army, taking on Gaddafi was personal. Haftar would have gone anyway. He had never forgiven Gaddafi for the way he deserted him in Chad some 20 years previously, and he wanted to get his own back. He was determined to be part of that rebellion. 1 month into the rebellion, Haftar arrived in Benghazi with a handful of his officers to cheering crowds. Within weeks, he was installed as the commander of the rebel forces. The CIA needed trainers to help this ragtag army that was forming. That's what Khalifa Haftar was there to do, to help organize an otherwise completely disorganized rebellion. With their preferred men in charge, the CIA was better placed to steer the Libyan rebellion. Haftar was in command of troops on the ground. Now, America helped lead the fight from the skies. NATO became, in effect, the rebel air force. There were about 17,000 NATO missions over that summer period, and of course, that needed a great deal of coordination from the ground. CIA agents from Italy, led by the Special Activities Division, operated covertly in Libya. They identified targets and called in airstrikes to support the rebels in their war against Gaddafi. There were CIA operatives there to help the rebels communicate with each other, to plan better, to be able to sustain their advances. Thanks to the CIA's support, within a few short months, the rebel forces took control of key Libyan cities. After 6 months of heavy fighting, the Libyan capital fell to the rebels, and Gaddafi went into hiding. Gaddafi disappeared, as did his sons. Nobody knew where Gaddafi had gone. The CIA now began hunting for the Libyan dictator, drawing on every available source. The agency eventually discovered that Gaddafi had retreated to the northern city of Sirte. Gaddafi had gone to Sirte with an ever-diminishing band of supporters, but gradually, the rebels' noose around Sirte from east and west was tightening. Gaddafi was surrounded. In the early hours, a convoy of vehicles attempted to break out of Sirte. In the skies above, NATO assets had been patrolling for a long time, and they were able instantly to see this unusual activity. The CIA scrambled a reconnaissance drone and scanned the airwaves for communications, desperate to find out if Gaddafi was in the convoy. Agents then received vital intelligence. A call from a satellite phone was intercepted from the convoy. The CIA confirmed it was Gaddafi. Gaddafi made a break for it in a convoy of dozens of vehicles, trying to get out of Sirte. The CIA now alerted United States Air Force drone commanders in Las Vegas, who launched a deadly Predator drone from a base in Sicily to intercept the convoy. In no time at all, Hellfire missiles were raining down. The drone's missiles slammed into the convoy, while NATO fighter jets bombed from overhead. As rebel forces advanced on the ground, Gaddafi was forced to make a break for it on foot. Gaddafi was dragged out, beaten, and thrown across the hood of a car. The rebels turned into a baying mob. They unleashed a murderous revenge upon Gaddafi for 4 decades of oppression. His body, beaten and bloodied, was paraded as a trophy. That was the very demeaning end to a man who had ruled Libya for 40 years, who had regarded himself as a prophet for the Arab people. For the CIA, Gaddafi's death was a triumph. They had always had him as a target, and although it had taken 30 years, eventually, their plan had worked. Haftar and his lieutenants were trained by the CIA to remove Gaddafi. The fact is that instead of helping to remove Gaddafi in the late 1980s, they came back 20 years later and finished the job. The CIA had been instrumental in removing Gaddafi in what, until now, the world believed was an entirely Libyan uprising.